Chapter 3, Putting Down Roots, Families in the Atlantic Empire. The character of early English settlements varied because of regional factors. A common language and heritage pulled English-American settlers together. However, by the 1690s, Parliament began to establish a uniform set of rules for an expanding American empire, bringing the colonies into closer contact with the motherland. Sources of stability: New England colonies of the 17th century. Colonists in New England successfully replicated a social order they had known in England, based on the primary social unit of the family. Immigrant families and new social order. In contrast to the early settlers of the Chesapeake colonies, who were primarily single males, the early settlers of New England migrated as families, providing a more stable basis for society. These families were better able to maintain local English customs and handle the strangeness of the New World, contributing to increased reproduction and unprecedented longevity. Additionally, a dispersed population, pure drinking water, and a cool climate helped retard the spread of contagious diseases and promoted good health. People who would have died in England or Virginia survived in New England. Commonwealth of families. In New England, town life was built upon the foundation of the family, and New England towns were essentially elaborate kinship networks with children rarely moving away. The household was the primary place of work, and the family was the basis for having and educating children. As towns matured, however, they took over the role of education by establishing schools supported by local taxes. New England achieved a literacy rate that the southern colonies would not match for another century. Harvard was the first institution of higher learning founded in the colonies. The family was also the basis of church life in New England, with congregations eventually becoming focused primarily on members rather than reaching out to the larger community. Outsiders who were not absorbed into an established family unit, and therefore the church and the town, often moved away. Women's lives in Puritan New England. Because the household was the primary unit of production, women's contribution and labor were essential for a successful household. They worked on family farms alongside their husbands and even often managed and ran the home as deputy husbands. Despite this, wives' political and legal rights were severely limited. They could own no property in their own right, and divorce, even from an abusive or irresponsible spouse, was rare and difficult to obtain. New England women tended to join churches in greater numbers than men. Social hierarchy in New England. With neither pauper nor nobleman, the New England colonists found their society incomplete by European standards, particularly when it came to the absence of wealth. Like most Europeans, they believed such well-placed persons were natural rulers. Gradually, the colonists sorted themselves into new social and economic groups, such as provincial gentry, yeomen, and indentured servants. Most northern colonists were yeoman farmers who worked their own land, but it was not unusual for northern colonists to work as servants at some point in their lives. Such servitude was more like an apprenticeship than the kind of servitude that developed in the Chesapeake, as there was ample room for upward social and economic mobility in New England. The challenge of the Chesapeake environment. Despite being founded at roughly the same time by people primarily from England, society developed quite differently in England's Chesapeake colonies than it had in New England. Family life at risk. Physical conditions were not as favorable for the survival or longevity in the Chesapeake colonies because of contagious diseases and contaminated drinking water. Most colonists came as individuals rather than as a family member, and there was an imbalance between the number of men and women. For those individuals that were able to create family life was much more unstable, and childbearing was extremely dangerous. Additionally, the prevalence of the practice of indentured servitude contributed to the instability of the Chesapeake society. Women were particularly vulnerable as servants. The structure of planter society. The cultivation of tobacco shaped Chesapeake society and perpetuated social inequality. Great planters dominated Chesapeake society by controlling large estates, the labor of indentured servants or slaves, and the political system of the colony. Freemen, usually former indentured servants, formed the largest class. The experience of indentured servitude was not degrading in and of itself, but the conditions of life as an indentured servant were difficult at best. Because the tobacco-based economy was based on the plantation, cities and towns were slow to develop, and especially after the 1680s, newcomers discovered that upward social mobility was more difficult to attain than in the northern cities. Race and freedom in British America. Many of the first settlers in America were not voluntary settlers, but were forced to migrate to the colonies as slaves. This practice only increased as the supply of white indentured servants dried up. Roots of slavery. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, almost 11 million blacks were brought to the Americans as slaves. Most were sold in South or Central America. Because slaves were required to endure hard labor, men were preferred, and in most slave communities outnumbered women by almost 2 to 1. There were almost no objections to enslaving Africans for life because economic considerations required cheap labor. Planters, however, generally justified slavery by identifying black Africans as heathens or barbarous in need of civilizing. At first, slavery and race were not intertwined, as some blacks were able to become free and a few to become successful planters themselves. But as the black population expanded, lawmakers drew up ever stricter slave codes. By 1700, slavery was undeniably based on the color of a person's skin. Constructing African American identities. Despite the cruelty and alienation of slavery, blacks developed their own unique African American culture in terms of music, art, religion, and language that was neither African nor European. Even so, the slave experience varied from colony to colony, with slaves in the South, where they made up a greater percentage of the population, better able to establish kinship relationships and maintain more African cultural traditions. By the 18th century, Creole slaves, those born in America, reproduced in greater numbers than the numbers of slaves imported from Africa. As slaves, many blacks protested with individual acts of violence in organized revolts, such as the Stono Uprising of 1739, or with the acts of nonviolent resistance. Others found opportunities for a degree of personal freedom by working, for example, as mariners on colonial sailing vessels. Rise of a commercial empire. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, a British policy of indifference towards the colonies was replaced by the one of intervention. Response to economic competition.